So that's our trailer, and that's Genesis Noir right there. Let me start up my actual presentation. Does the mic work? Okay, great. It doesn't sound like it does to my ears. Recovering from a cold, I'm sorry. Let's see, we're starting right here. How do I do the thing? Slide, view, present. There we go. Wait, loading. It's loading? All right, well then we're just gonna do it like this. So you all can see my great notes. So if I say dumb things, you can just read the words, and that's what I'm supposed to be saying. So this is the first talk I've ever done, so. So anyway, I'm Jeremy Abel. I'm the technical lead for Genesis Noir. Genesis Noir is a weird point-and-click adventure game set before, during, and after the Big Bang. And to save a god of the universe, you have to stop the Big Bang. I can just hit the down button, right? No, I just click the slide. Anyway, it's a game where you can explore an extra-dimensional jazz club and make important phone calls and destroy your whole house in the process. Can I zoom in so I can read my words? Yeah, whatever. Anyway, it's a game with the game really focuses on abstract interactions and evocative play. Blech. Words are hard. It's a game with a focus on abstract spaces and evocative, playful interactions. And let's see. We're going for a goal of a synthesis of animations and interactivity, which I guess is what a video game is. But how do we, arrive at this weird aesthetic that we have? So I guess I'll go into a bit of a background. So who remembers this thing? Yeah, it's Winamp from 1998 or something. So if you pressed a weird keyboard shortcut in that program, you got to a thing called Audio Visualization System, which let you make really weird stuff like this with this arcane interface that really is bizarre and strange, and the code makes no sense. That's where I started, and around the same time, I was really into Metal Gear Solid 2, and I'd seen the introduction cutscene of that, and I'd never seen like this fusing of typography and movement and imagery in a place like this before. And I was like, that's what I want to do with my life. I'm going to go to school to make that kind of stuff. And around the same time, Flash was getting really big. Places like Newgrounds and Albino Black Sheep, which was like this pre-YouTube entertainment space on the web where you might have been like a schoolyard thing where your friends would tell you about the site and you go check it out, and these like weird cartoons and weird interactions and strange games and stuff. I think Albino Black Sheep was a little more curated than Newgrounds was, but they're both pretty unique. And that was where I had found stuff like Vector Park and earlier Amanita stuff, like Samaros 1 and stuff, which was all Flash-based things. And they were a little like puzzle games, a little like adventure games, but they were way more interested in making fun interactions, the stuff that felt good to play with rather than really like busting your brain on stuff. And so I was like, great, I'm going to go to school to make weird animations and fun interactive stuff. And I got to school, and here's me and my game partner. I don't remember what we were doing here, but it was some stage nonsense. So I went to school for new media design, and it was basically learning to make expensive websites and expensive animations for selling stuff. So they'd be like, make up a product and then make a little animation that sells it. But we were also doing a lot of stuff with Flash, and we were all kind of really inspired by those simple, evocative interactions that I mentioned previously. So we were making like, great, buy deodorant, and it's a little mini game that you have to play, or like a car, only it's a dress-up game, so you have to put parts on a car or something stupid. And I don't know what these next slides are. Oh yeah, so where was I going? Right, so we learned to make these weird interactions and weird sites, and a lot of those incorporated a thing called motion graphics, which was kind of a thing that was pioneered by this guy, Oscar Fischinger, in, I wasn't smart enough to write down the year. I think it was the 50s, but I'm totally making that up. So school was split like 50-50 between doing weird websites and doing weird animation, but it was all for a commercial purpose. But Oscar Fischinger had been doing this kind of thing for years, and this is one of his animations where it was like synced to some background music, which I don't have. We just have this lovely GIF. And And usually, you kind of see that kind of stuff in cartoons, but it's only really used for weird psychedelic trippy sequences. Like, oh god, Pikachu took some acid and now he's just tripping out. So it's like this stuff morphing into other things is a big thing of it. And it has a really unique design language apart from these weird psychedelic trippy sequences that's really kind of coming to a forefront in the mid-2000s. And there's like three main principles I think I'll outline. They have really fluid animation, so you can see here like just stuff really transforms from one thing to another as a way of communicating meaning beyond just like a traditional scene. The space is really abstracted. You have multiple camera angles doing stuff at once. Stuff is superimposed. It's not really a logical space. And the transitions usually are used for storytelling purposes. Like, oh, this goes from a clock to this guy resting, and it's like, oh, he's the lazy guy or something. And so we're trying to get that into a game a bit, because that's where our background comes from. So like, how can we bring that aesthetic to the world of games? And games, the 3D engines especially, aren't really made for doing that. Like, you open Unreal and it's like, oh, here's some sky, play some rocks. It's like make a first-person shooter level, more or less. But especially stuff that we're doing isn't at a realistic scale, so the physics engines don't really work properly. And like, one of the things we first tried was this interaction where you go to open a door to a speakeasy, and like a panel on the door slides open, and you have to give a guy a password. But instead of you seeing the door, the guy's face appears giant behind you. And the reason we do that is because when you solve the thing, his face turns into a key, which is shown unlocking the door. And we're all about that kind of weird juxtaposition of just giant stuff and weird spaces. And the tools used to make that are stuff like Adobe After Effects and programs that don't really abide by traditional game rules, where you can just reorder the order things are rendered in. You have all the blend modes in the world. It's basically like Photoshop, only with animation. So how do we, get that kind of stuff in games? And the answer is to really abuse a level editor. So the other, I guess the other main point is, we want to be able to use these programs to still make our game, because that's what we're comfortable using as an artist. So all of our levels are actually designed in Cinema 4D, and we mock up camera moves, but that's not really made for game dev. So we've had to make our own custom tools to go from that animation world into Cinema 4D. And God, I wish I could read these words. So yeah, I mean, it's like, how much time do you want to spend getting used to either new tools and dealing with those restrictions, or how much time do you spend, forcing your existing tools to work? And our choice was to force our existing tools to work, which we're still, we still don't know if that's the right choice or not, but hopefully it will be. Mainly because of the ability to change your design and iterate stuff as quickly as possible is really important, especially because we're not traditionally game developers. So we're used to working in an animation mode where you'll get feedback from a client, and you're expected to fix it in like an hour. It's like, oh, you can make this move a little faster, or a little slower, or try this or that. When we try to move that stuff into game development world, it's like, oh, that's going to take me a day or 2 days, or stuff that's not physically possible. Especially when it comes to swapping render orders around and things. So yeah, we've had to write our own plugins a lot of times to convert from one weird program to another. So here's some examples of just weird geometry. This is the introduction of the game, which looks two-dimensional when you see it in the game, but is actually a really weird, abstracted 3D scene. And just because you have a level editor that's like, make a realistic thing, you don't have to abide by that at all. Let's see, what's the next one? All the perspective stuff is like super faked. We have giant gradients in front of the screen to simulate like light bloom and all that kind of stuff. And we also have our own render code, which is great because in Unreal you can just modify whatever you want mostly. So we have things that will render, it's like a portal effect almost, that will render stuff from a layer that's further back in depth in the front of other objects, which we use a fair deal. Let's see, what is next? Yeah, and here's some examples of, like, we do a lot of mixing of 2D animation with 3D, and all of the 2D animation is actually done in Flash. but there's no good way of getting that into Unreal, and we've tried all manner of things. Our current solution is a plugin called Bluey. Oops, that one, which basically allows you to run a little Chrome browser in Unreal. It just renders it to a texture. So we export JavaScript from Flash, and then we run it inside a Chrome browser in Unreal, and it's a horrible nightmare. Previously, we tried to, because it's vector, so we want these crisp vector lines, and we have these big full-frame 2D animation sequences that running at like 1080p. So each frame of that, if you wanted to render it as like a sprite sheet, would be, a megabyte a frame or 500 kilobytes a frame, which is, when you have like an hour of this in your game, it's not really acceptable in terms of like size. So one thing we tried was, okay, we'll convert each frame into a 3D mesh using SVG, the 3D converter thing, and then we'll just blast through these frames. So we have like 30 OBJ files that were all smashed into one, and we just toggle one off and toggle each one on to whatever frame rate we animated at. And that worked okay, but it was still pretty big. And the easiest thing we found now is just getting it in JavaScript and putting it in there. But the downside there is that we can only really run one instance of it at once before it just craps out. So why go through all of that trouble? And the answer is because creative expression or something. Like you gotta, I think for us it's really important to use the tools that we're most comfortable in. And yeah, like I said before, the ability to iterate through stuff as fast as possible is really important. And the benefit of like knowing the stuff, the tools that you've used in the past and being able to use that for a new purpose. And because the tools that we usually use are either in open source or allow for scripting or allow you to have some middleman between one format and another because the formats are open in some way, really allows us to customize things. And that goes, you can write a game in HyperCard from 1992 if you really wanted. So yeah, that's, I thought this would take longer, but that's all I've prepared. Adam, you have some backup for me.
I did. Thank you so much for bringing this stuff in, dude. This is so cool. I want to turn over for other people to ask questions in a minute here, but there's a point earlier about motion graphics that I think is really weird. And you're talking about how there's a lot of abstraction in motion graphics, which to me makes a lot of sense because it's about these unexpected transitions between things. And the meaning coming from the transitions makes a lot of sense to me. It's montage and film theory and all that stuff. The obsession with fluidity in it, I think, is really, really weird. And I was curious if you had anything more to add on that, because to me that's not like a integral. It's integral in the sense that it's that they all do it. Right. But
yeah, it is strange. I don't. So there's one of the main design studios is Buck the animation studio. They outdo everyone in terms of like craft in this kind of stuff, and so they'll make like a 30-second TV spot with like 20 animators on staff, and it just looks like the most polished thing you've ever seen in your life. So everyone kind of tries to mimic that aesthetic, and how many frames can you cram in? How juicy does your animation look? I don't actually know where that first came from. I mean, it kind of. I was watching it last night, and it kind of harkens back to like old Betty Boop cartoons and stuff, where everything's super jiggly and like really. Yeah, I mean, it's similar in fluidity there, I think.
Yeah, some kind of like just like pleasure from motion.
Yeah.
And the smoother and weirder it is, the better.
Yeah, I mean, it just looks nice, I guess.
Yeah. And the other thing that stuck out to me is like in moving this stuff through, like you mentioned the running Flash that was exported to Java in a Chrome browser window instance inside of Unreal Engine. Is that the most insane thing that you guys have tried to do?
At the moment, probably.
What's the second most insane thing you tried to do?
Probably writing our own things that allow you to import a Cinema 4D scene into Unreal directly and be able to go back and forth. So normally you can like export a FBX file or something, which is like a mesh format, to Unreal, or from Cinema, and load that into Unreal, but it doesn't keep parity between the Cinema 4D objects, so you can't modify the Cinema 4D scene, re-export it, and then have those. It won't take take like the same properties of objects. So we'll like have props in the level, and we'll go into Unreal and add components to that, like, oh, make a sound when you click this kind of stuff. So if we try to modify the Cinema 4D scene and re-import it, all those properties and components get destroyed entirely. So instead, our own custom.
That sounds cool.
Yeah, it's great. It's really, really helpful. So instead, our exporter uses the unique. Every object in Cinema 4D has a unique ID number, and it uses that to link objects in Unreal with the Cinema 4D objects. It just has an invisible component that says, in Unreal, my object in Cinema has this ID, so if the file changes, look for this ID again and update my scale or position or rotation or whatever it happens to be.
So you guys have a workflow where you have Unreal Engine is open over here,
Yeah.
and you can actually almost live edit
Right.
the Unreal components in the art tool that you like.
Right.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's unironically cool. My other question was about like how is all of this stuff sort of funneling into this kind of like mix of game design and like toy design, or
Right.
like game design around feel.
Right.
Like it does seem like a good fit to me. But like, where are there places where you guys are finding like, oh, there's this thing that looks really cool, but you can't play with it.
Right.
Or I made it so you can play with it, and now it doesn't look cool anymore.
Right.
And like, how do you like pull that apart?
Well, I mean, oh god, I gotta think about that one. I mean, we've looked at these animations, and it's like, oh, that'd be really great if stuff like that was interactive. But all of the tech behind those animations are just like manual frames. Like once you render out that animation, it's locked. You can't change it. You can't, you can skip forward and backwards in time, but it's not like you can move the camera around or any of that kind of stuff. So I think it's really interesting to, have that in an interactive space, like because it really lends itself to the playfulness, because it's like, oh, just the reward itself is, more of that kind of, like, you don't know what's going to happen next, what the transition from one scene to another is going to be. So we're kind of looking at that as like a reward mechanic almost.
And there's this weird thing of like players kind of like barging in on the thing.
Right.
I think it was Karina's game earlier. 10. It's been a long day. What's it called? 10 somethings.
Yeah.
10 Mississippi. Yeah, 10 Mississippi, where like there's this sort of like, oh, I'm doing a thing, and I'm gonna have this like nice animation transition thing that happens, but that's now like lag because it's interactive, and you
Right.
want it to be like kind of like in the moment. And if you make people like wait and not be able to do a thing, then like maybe they're mad. So like the animation needs to be even cooler. So
Right.
they're like, I'm gonna sit back and watch this
Yeah.
before I start messing with it
Yeah.
again.
It's like, here's a 30-minute cutscene or 30-second cutscene. It's like, well, great, but it should look really good.
Yeah.
You don't want to sit through 30 minutes.
Have you guys run into weird things of like animation systems like, oh, we set this cool thing in Cinema 4D and it works like this, but now a player is clicking on it and it's partway through.
Right.
And like, does it reset? Do we like let them change it in the middle?
Right.
Like,
yeah. That's
because normally these things.
That's
aren't
our biggest nightmare, I think, is dealing with all those situations. It's like, well, what feels best, mainly? Because let me go back.
Because normally, like the big thing, right, is like these things are so cool, and they're, regardless of whether the camera moves around, like they're not branching.
Right.
So
like one thing we did, especially with this, rotary phone interaction, is just to kind of resign the animation and let the physics system handle it, almost. Because in here we have the spinning of the phone attached directly to this just force that spins all the stuff in your room around, and it's a metaphor for, oh, you're dialing the phone, but it's destroying your life. The phone call that you're going to make is going to destroy your world. So that's what that is.
cool.
Yeah.
Does anybody out there have questions for? Do you want to say a little more about the team that is?
Oh yeah.
been
So
working on this?
our animator is my friend Evan Anthony. He was the guy in our school picture who I was chasing. He's the jaunty lad right there. I wish I remembered what this was. It's just a really good GIF. I like it a lot. Yeah, I was. Yeah.
There were just so many of these that you can't remember which
Yeah.
one that was.
Yeah, it was. I don't. Yeah, I think I might have been trying to be like rain or something. And there's like rain on this sheet that I'm shaking, and I don't remember. If yeah, I'll find out, and I'll ask him, and I'll find out. We'll see. Anyway, what was the question?
Oh, sorry. So Evan's the animator.
Right. Yeah. Right.
You have
And then we're
working
with a couple guys in London called Skillbard. They're part of Late Night Work Club, who also is part. Scott Benson, who did Night in the Woods, is also part of that crew, and they are just really outstanding. So they've been a lot of fun to work with, and we've also miscellaneous friends and other animator cohorts, and the goal of the whole thing is really just to work with as many friends as we can. We're doing a Kickstarter in January, and all the money from that will just be used to pay friends to just make cool stuff for the game. So that's our background and our team.
Oh yeah, I got a question up here.
Hi, Ricky.
Hello. I want to know more about the story.
Oh God. Okay. I don't have slides for that. Okay,
What
right.
about an interpretive stage performance of the story?
Let me just get up and do a dance. So, it's a noir kind of adventure thing set before, during, and after the Big Bang. All the characters are, gods of the universe. And one god wants to kill another god with a gunshot, and that gunshot is the Big Bang. And the expanding universe is the bullet trail that's going towards the woman you love, and you have to try to jump inside the expanding universe to try to find a way to slow it down. And along the way, you'll encounter humans in the world and see if they can help you out or hinder you as you try to slow this down. That's basically the plot.
Are there other stories where like some of this stuff is not like? I guess what kind of storytelling like inspired you guys to go?
So
to
there's
this,
a
like,
novel. Oh, I got a good answer for this one. There's a novel by Italo Calvino called Cosmic Comics, and it's a bunch of little short stories that start with a scientific premise and go off in a weird abstract direction. I'll try and retell one here quickly.
I just read these, so I'm going to judge you on accuracy.
Okay,
just a heads
so
up.
the first one, I think, you know how the moon gives tidal forces on the Earth. It causes tides. So imagine way back when the Earth was first formed and the moon was first formed, they were way closer together. And the moon would get so close to the Earth that the sea would pull up into columns, and you could travel between. Imagine if there were people at the same time, you could travel between the Earth and the moon on boats. You could just row up this river that connected the planet together. And that's all of the story that I remember.
That's most of it.
Yeah.
A lot of the stories are kind of about like him wanting to like get with various ladies.
Yeah.
Like, he wants to like get with the moon, but they do have all this. They do have this weird thing. They all have this weird like little funny quote at the start. You know.
Yeah.
Here's a quote unquote science thing.
Yeah.
And now like let's unfold it into a thing about people instead.
Yeah, like one of the stories is like, oh, you're an elemental particle in the early soup of the universe, and you're like a family, and you're like, how do you make particles talk? And it's just like, oh, they're regular people, but they're like experiencing problems being squished by the force of gravity, and they're just like, oh man, I was going to work, but I got squished really bad. And it's just cute and amusing, and we like it a lot.
Any other questions? Oh, hang on. Let me get up in the middle here.
I can't see anything on account of this light.
Hi, I was just wondering why noir? Do you think there's things about noir that lend themselves to this kind of motion graphics animation?
Yeah, I mean, along with the the black and white aesthetic and the sharp contrast and shadow that you normally see in noir movies, the aesthetic kind of lends itself to that. But we just liked the way it looked. At least that's my. I'm not the artist, so I can't answer that super well. But I mean, it's noir in the sense that there's a lot of those elements in storytelling, a lot of inevitability and futility in the things that you're trying to do. You're trying to stop the Big Bang. That's a inherently futile kind of effort. So that's where the noir comes from, at least. Hopefully, that's a acceptable answer. Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Not easily, no. Not at the moment. I think. Oh well, here let's just go down through the stuff that comes. Here, I'll just go through these. Yeah, here's some. Here's you're planting seeds in a garden of the early universe. There's a sunflower. Let's see. There's that thing. You can walk inside a gas giant. There's a thing that says lorem ipsum on it. Great. Yep. Great. This came from our pitch deck, so it's like half pitch deck that we just chopped apart. That is all I have on hand. But you can go to our site and we have a whole bunch of stuff that I would love to load if the internet wasn't terrible. Anybody else?
Any other questions? Oh, there is.
Ooh.
Hi. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, you're getting inspired and using a genre that has like very heavy kind of gendered tropes,
Right.
like sexy tropes actually, like in that case. And you're definitely using that with like that kind of setup with like the man who's kind of a detective and then the like woman who gets tragically killed.
Right.
And you try to sever or whatever. And I'm just wondering like how you try to approach that and like honor the medium without like falling into these tropes that are kind of helpful and maybe try to subvert them.
Right. Well, we actually were talking about that last week about how to do that, and we are working on it currently. The main other love interest is the representation of humanity, which is like basically the way the game is structured is it's a bunch of little short stories that are connected, and in each short story, you meet a different aspect of humanity that's represented as it could be a jazz singer guy or a hunter-gatherer, and they're usually represented as different genders for each one. So you sort of fall in love with this overall concept of humanity as a genderless sort of construct. So that's one interesting thing that we're doing, but it's definitely something that is definitely on our minds that we're working towards.